there is a civilization that does not fit the map, not in the way that mysteries are usually framed, with missing temples, erased inscriptions, or disputed timelines. This one was hiding in plain sight, written into stone, baked into tablets, spoken about for 2 centuries of modern scholarship. The Sumerians were not lost, they were, historians thought, understood, and then the DNA arrived. For decades, the question of who the Sumerians actually were not just what they built, but where they came from, who they carried in their bloodlines, had been framed as a matter of archaeology and linguistics. Scholars pointed to pottery styles, in temple architecture, irrigation patterns. They traced the probable routes that early farming populations might have taken across the Fertile Crescent. They built a story, a reasonable one, a story that felt for a long time complete. That story is no longer complete because when researchers began extracting ancient DNA from Sumerian burial sites and comparing those genomes to populations across the ancient and modern world, something appeared in the data that did not belong in the model, not a small statistical noise, not an ambiguous signal, something that pointed in a direction no one had predicted. This is the story of what they found and why it changes everything we thought we knew about the first civilization. The conventional account of Sumerian origins was, for most of the 20th century, relatively settled southern Mesopotamia. The region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq was inhabited by farming communities as early as the 7th millennium BCE. These were people descended from the agricultural revolution that had swept across the Near East. They planted grain, built irrigation ditches, organized into villages. Over generations, those villages became towns. The towns became something unprecedented, cities by roughly 4500 BCE. The people called the Sumerians had emerged as the dominant cultural force in the region. They built Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur. They invented writing not as an intellectual exercise, but as a technology of administration. They developed mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and a cosmology so elaborate that echoes of it have been found woven into much later religious traditions. Who were they? The Standard Model said, descendants of the Neolithic farmers of the Near East, shaped by thousands of years of local development, with likely waves of population mixing from neighboring regions, from Anatolia to the north, from the Iranian plateau to the east. A mosaic, yes, but a local mosaic, a regional story. That model rested on reasonable assumptions. It made geographic sense. It aligned with what archaeologists had observed on the ground. The problem was that it had never been tested against the genome. The first friction appeared not in a genetics laboratory, but in the historical and linguistic record. Sumerian is a language unlike any other. This has been known since the 19th century, when scholars first began deciphering the cuneiform tablets pulled from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives, no sister languages, no ancestral family. It sits entirely alone in the linguistic tree of humanity, connected to nothing on either side. For comparison, most of the languages spoken across Europe, Iran, and northern India belong to a single massive family, Indo-European. Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Amharic are part of the Semitic family. Even languages spoken by much smaller populations often reveal ancestral connections when enough vocabulary and grammar is examined. Sumerian reveals nothing. Scholars have proposed connections over the years to Dravidian languages of South Asia, to ancient Elamite, to hypothetical proto-languages of the ancient Near East. None of these proposals has survived rigorous scrutiny. Sumerian remains to this day a linguistic ghost, rich, complex, fully documented, and completely alone. Linguists found this frustrating but not alarming. Language dialects exist elsewhere. The Basques of northern Spain speak a language with no known relatives. Barusho, spoken in the mountains of northern Pakistan, is similarly isolated. Isolation does not by itself imply exotic origins, but the linguistic mystery planted a question that would not go away. If the Sumerians spoke a language unlike any other, was it possible that something in their ancestry was also unlike what the regional model predicted? That question took on new urgency when ancient DNA analysis reached Mesopotamia. Genomics, the study of full genomes rather than isolated fragments, had already transformed our understanding of dozens of ancient populations. The ancient DNA revolution, accelerated by advances in sequencing technology during the 2010s, had rewritten the prehistory of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It revealed mass migrations that archaeology had missed. It identified ghost populations, ancestral groups that had no living descendants, but whose genetic signatures persisted inside modern and ancient genomes like messages embedded in a language no one had spoken for millennia. Ancient DNA analysis works by extracting genetic material from bones or teeth of individuals who died thousands of years ago. Researchers sequence that material compare it to reference panels of ancient and modern populations, and calculate which population clusters contributed ancestry to the ancient individual. The technique is sophisticated enough to distinguish between admixture events that happened 4,000 years ago and ones that happened 6,000 years ago. When researchers applied these methods to ancient remains from southern Mesopotamia individuals buried during the height of Sumerian civilization, between roughly 3000 and 2000 BCE, the result were not what anyone had simply assumed. The broad contours were partially expected. The Sumerian genomes did show significant ancestry from the Neolithic farmers of the ancient Near East. They carried genetic profiles consistent with populations from the Iranian plateau, from Anatolia, from the region broadly understood as the cradle of agriculture. In that sense, they looked like what the model predicted, but the proportions were off, and one signal specifically did not belong. The ancestral components that most researchers expected to dominate the Sumerian genomes, the Near Eastern farmer ancestry. The Iranian-related ancestry were present, but they were not the complete picture. There was a third stream. This is where the investigation deepens, because identifying ancestry components in ancient genomes is not like reading a label. It is more like reading an echo. Researchers use statistical models to decompose a genome into contributions from known reference populations. When a component appears that does not match any known source population cleanly, it becomes a problem. It becomes a question. The component that appeared in some Sumerian era genomes was neither typically Levantine nor straightforwardly Iranian, nor Anatolian. Depending on the study and the modeling framework used, researchers have described it variably, sometimes as ancestry related to populations further east than expected, sometimes as a signal pointing towards South or Central Asian populations, sometimes as a component that most closely resembled what geneticists have termed ancient ancestral South Eurasian lineages. No single study has resolved this definitively. The field is still young when it comes to Mesopotamian ancient DNA. Sample sizes remain limited. Not every burial site has yielded usable genetic material. The reference panels used for comparison have changed as more ancient genomes have been sequenced. But several independent lines of analysis have pointed toward the same unresolved conclusion. The Sumerian genome contains something that the Near Eastern regional model does not fully account for. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where the evidence forces the map to be redrawn, subscribe, because what comes next is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Three explanatory frameworks have emerged to account for this anomaly. The first is that the unexpected ancestry component represents an early migration into Mesopotamia from further east, perhaps from populations living on or near the Iranian plateau in its deeper interior, or from populations connected to the ancient inhabitants of the Indus River region. Under this model, the Sumerians were not simply the local product of Near Eastern agricultural development. They represented a meeting point, a place where Western Fertile Crescent populations and Eastern populations moving through Iran or along ancient coastal routes came into contact and over thousands of years merged. This interpretation is not without support. There is archaeological evidence of cultural contact between early Mesopotamia and the ancient Indus Valley's civilization trade goods, similar administrative technologies, shared artistic motifs. Genetic contact is plausible alongside cultural contact, but it does not by itself explain why the ancestry signal in Sumerian genomes appears not in the form of recent admixture, but as a deep ancestral component woven into the population's core. The second framework invokes the concept of a ghost population in population genetics. A ghost population is a group that left no direct modern descendants, or whose descendants have become so dispersed and mixed that the original population is no longer identifiable in living humans. Ghost populations are detected precisely because their genetic signature appears in ancient genomes without a clear living match. Under this framework, the anomalous component in Sumerian DNA may represent the remnants of a population that inhabited the region before the agricultural expansion, a group that was neither the classic Anatolian farmer nor the Iranian Highlander, but something older, perhaps descended from Upper Paleolithic inhabitants of the greater Middle East, whose story has been almost entirely erased. And the third framework is more conservative and perhaps more honest about the limits of current data. It holds that the apparent anomaly may partly reflect gaps in the reference panels used for comparison. Ancient DNA studies are only as good as the ancient populations they can compare against. If there are entire branches of human prehistory in the greater Middle East and South Asia that have not yet been sequenced in sufficient numbers, it is possible that what looks like an unexpected signal is simply an expected signal from a population that has not yet been properly characterized in the genetic record. The science does not yet permit certainty, but the mystery is real. The most significant advance in understanding Sumerian ancestry came from a landmark analysis published in the early 2020s in part of a broader wave of ancient genomic research focusing on the ancient Near East and Bronze Age Eurasia. This study, drawing on remains from multiple Mesopotamian sites and comparing them against one of the largest reference panels ever assembled for the region, reached a carefully worded but consequential conclusion. The Sumerian era individuals showed genetic profiles that were largely consistent with a mixture of Near Eastern ancestries. But the modeling consistently produced a residual component, a portion of the ancestral signal that no available reference population absorbed cleanly. And the researchers noted it. They did not dismiss it. They flagged it as a direction for future investigation. What made this particularly striking was the comparison panel. The study compared the Sumerian genomes not just to neighboring ancient populations, but to populations from across Eurasia, from Western Europe to the Caucasus to South and Southeast Asia. The signal that did not fit the Near Eastern model was not pointing north, it was not pointing west, it pointed east, not toward the populations that had been historically most associated with Mesopotamian ancestry, not toward the obvious candidates, the unexpected affinity partial, contested, but statistically present, oriented itself toward populations that, historically speaking, had no particular reason to be part of this story at all. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. Consider what it means to stand in southern Iraq today, in the region where once rose above the flat floodplain, where the ziggurat of Nana, the moon god, once cast its shadow over the oldest urban landscape on Earth. The land there is relentlessly flat, the horizon unbroken, the light merciless, the Euphrates sluggish and silt heavy, moves with no urgency. Reed marshes stretch toward the south. The soil is dark where water has reached it, and pale where the land has gone dry. This is the ground where writing was invented, where the first legal code was inscribed, where the first known libraries were built, shelving thousands of clay tablets, cataloging debts, hymns, astronomical observations, and stories of gods and floods. The people who built this, who dug the canals, raised the walls, maintained the temples across centuries, were not a myth. They were biological human beings. They had mothers and fathers. They carried genes from people who lived long before them, people whose names we will never know, people who moved across the ancient world long before anyone thought to record the movement. Their genome preserved what history forgot and what it preserved, it seems, is a journey longer and stranger than the regional story allowed. Why does any of this matter beyond the academic satisfaction of knowing where an ancient people came from? Because the Sumerian anomaly is not really about the Sumerians. It is about the nature of civilization itself. The standard narrative of human prehistory tends toward clarity. Populations form, settle, develop, and build. Each civilization is the product of its local geography and its regional ancestry. The story moves forward in one direction. It is legible, but genomics, wherever it has been applied with sufficient depth and care, has consistently disrupted this narrative. The ancient Europeans were not who modern Europeans thought they were. The ancestors of the Han Chinese carried genetic traces of migrations that classical Chinese history did not record. The ancient inhabitants of the Indus Valley were connected to citizens far to the north and west in ways that upended models of South Asian prehistory. Everywhere, the genome has been examined against the standard account. The standard account has proven too simple. The Sumerian case follows this pattern. It suggests that the people who invented writing, who built the first cities, who organized the first large-scale irrigation systems, were themselves the product of ancestral journeys that current models have not fully traced. That somewhere in their past, before the cities rose, before the tablets were inscribed, there was a meeting, perhaps many meetings, in people converging on the floodplain from directions the conventional model underestimated. This does not diminish the Sumerian achievement, it deepens it. It places it inside a human story that is larger, older, and more intricate than the map we drew. There is a tendency when new genomic evidence complicates a historical narrative to treat the complication as a kind of loss, as though the mystery undermines the meaning, as though a people becomes less real, less legible, less theirs when their origins turn out to be layered. That tendency mistakes clarity for truth. The Sumerians wrote in their own language that humanity was created from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. They described a time before the flood, a lineage of kings stretching back into mythological time, a world in which the boundaries between human and divine were navigable. Their cosmology was a story about where they came from, told in the most human way possible. The genome tells a different kind of story, quieter, more fragmented, without gods or floods or divine bloodlines. It speaks in statistical distributions and ancestral components and reference panels. But it says something the mythology cannot, that the people who built the first civilization were themselves the product of a world in motion, that the ancestral lines running into those Mesopotamian bodies had traveled farther and met in stranger configurations than anyone had previously guessed. One result doesn't fit, and that one result may be the most important thing the data has told us, because it means the story is not over. It means the map is not finished. It means that somewhere between the known populations and the sequenced genomes and the ancient burial grounds of southern Iraq, there is still a piece of the human past that has not yet been named, not yet located, not yet brought fully into the light. The genome preserved it. Science is beginning to read it. We are still, in the oldest sense of the word, excavating. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next layer of the map is uncovered, because the past is not finished revealing itself, and the stories that matter most are always the ones that refuse to stay simple.